Hello, my name is Claude Butner, and I have the honor of being the host for today's 265th CACOR Live presentation. The title is The Coming Population Collapse. Our speaker is Ugo Bardi, a polymath who has interests that go from ancient history to the future of humankind. After a career of lecturer in the School of Chemical Sciences at the University of Florence, he is now active as a member of the Club of Rome and the World Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is author of several nonfiction and fiction books that deal with the future and what it has in store for humankind. The most recent one in English that's published is Exterminations, with the title being self-explanatory. More than 50 years later, the population projections of the 1972 report to the Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth, are becoming reality. After millennia of population growth, humankind is crossing a historical threshold. Within a few decades, perhaps years, it will start a phase of rapid decline. The Limits to Growth was the first integrated model study of the trajectory of the world's economic system. It included human population as a parameter, and the business as usual scenario saw it starting a rapid decline around mid-21st century. Later studies using the same methods placed the population peak roughly between 2030 and 2040, contradicting the standard demographic forecast that didn't prefigure a peak before the last decades of the century. The current data appear to agree with the limits to growth assessment, indicating a rapid slowdown of population growth everywhere. Most industrialized countries are already declining in absolute numbers, while many others are approaching that point. In a few decades at most, we'll reach a major turning point in humankind's history. The consequences are all to be seen. Ugo, welcome back. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Claude. Am I on screen? I cannot see me, but I hope.
Yes, you are.
I am. Okay, perfect. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I was already here in December of last year, and after in January I started writing a new book, which I completed in a few months, and it is the book I will be telling you something about. The new book is titled "The End of Population Growth," a provisional title, and it deals with exactly what Claude said, the rapid slowdown of population growth in the world, almost everywhere, and which prefigures decline or perhaps even a collapse. As you know, all this has an origin, and the origin is this book that you may know, The Limits to Growth. This is a copy, an original copy from 1972. It's a book which spawned a lot of children. And the book that I wrote and we will be publishing in a couple of months from now, hopefully, is a grandson of this book. And this book was extremely important, one of the milestones of science of the 20th century. And it is known mainly for this diagram that I could try to show to you. You can see it here. Okay. And you see these curves that go up and then down, growth and collapse. So the point of this catastrophistic approach, which is what comes from the modeling, is that there is a progression in the evolution of a system like the human economy, which uses resources to build an industrial and agricultural capital and another kind of capital that you may call the population, the human population. Sometimes the economists use the term human capital. And the whole enterprise generates pollution. And this interaction among the various elements of the system has a progression. It starts growing. First, you grow the industrial production and the agricultural production. It grows, it generates human capital and industrial capital. And you grow at some moment, the first thing that starts declining, the resources, mineral resources, fertile soil, and all kind of biological resources, they are the first to go under strain, to start having a negative effect on the growth of the system, which sputters down, stops growing fast, and then eventually gets a limit. And then we see that also on population. Population is supposed by the model to start its decline a little later than the industrial production, the industrial capital, the economy in general. And that's the point is, it's difficult to predict or to say exactly when that will happen, but you can see it here, this curve here, the one you see here, I'm touching it with my finger, is the population. Already in 1972, the authors of The Limits to Growth saw that the population, the human population, the global human population would start declining around 2040, 2050. Sort of this kind of calculations are not supposed to be predictions, are not supposed to be prophecies. We don't have crystal balls for oracles, but the whole point is that you had this photograph, this picture of the system. The system could not grow forever, evidently, because it had eventually to arrive to a maximum. Now, if you have 10 minutes, I would like to tell you a little story about how this kind of approach came about, because it is an interesting story. Let me show it to you on the whiteboard. Let's see. We can do this. Now, you see the whiteboard? Yes, I think so. It's good. Okay, so we start, wait a second, or a little space for Ugo Bardi. We start with some idea that population, biological population, is a field of study which deals with the growth, decline, and generally speaking, the trajectory of biological population, which can be anything, microorganisms, animals, human beings, whatever. And how do you present this? You have, typically you use a Cartesian diagram. You can see it with population here and the time here. How does it grow? And incidentally, Cartesian diagrams have been in use from more or less the mid-19th century, and they started being used with population studies because they were very useful to show the behavior of a population. So what happens? You have some moment t equals 0. You have one small population. Let's say you have 2 rabbits. Rabbits reproduce. As you know, rabbits reproduce like rabbits. And so what you probably know, what you expect to see is something like this. A curve that goes like that, which you call geometric growth, or you could call also exponential growth, not exactly the same thing, but anyway, the idea is that it grows very fast, very fast. 2 rabbits, 4 rabbits, 8 rabbits, 16 rabbits, 32 rabbits, 64 rabbits, 128 rabbits, and on you go. It took some time before people started understanding this point and started that it also happens for human beings, because when these things started being discussed and visualized and disseminated, people thought that there was such a thing as the urge to reproduce. Human beings were said to have this honestly, I don't think humans had so much an urge to reproduce, but to do the thing that causes reproduction, but eventually comes to about the same. And indeed, human population has been going like this up to recent times. And we owe to the Reverend Thomas Malthus, he was the first who noted this idea, said, okay, well, we have this geometrical growth. Malthus was not a mathematician, but he never published a graph. We are at the end of the 18th century, the late 1700s, but he had this idea, this good idea of saying, well, look, there is a sort of barrier here. You cannot grow over a certain limit. And he didn't use the term, but he was the first to understand the existence of what we call today the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity. Let me write it. It means that agriculture or whatever you use to support your population cannot go over a certain number. And he said that for us it is rather obvious, but he was not exactly the first, but among the first. And he was actually optimistic because he said, this carrying capacity is not necessarily fixed. We can change it. We could do something like this and keep growing, but more slowly. And as I said, Malthus was an optimist. Today, everybody says Malthus was a monster. It was all wrong. He was an enemy of humankind. He advocated plagues and famines and things. I said, we arrived to that point. Of course, something has to happen to stop people from reproducing like rabbits, the wrath of God, like plagues, pestilences, famines, wars, sickness, or whatever you have, it will stop. But Malthus never discussed collapse. He said, well, we arrived there, and there we stopped. Was optimistic. Because we know much more now. Later on, one guy called Verhulst, a French mathematician, put Malthus' ideas in a mathematical form, and he said we have something like this, which you probably recognize. It is called the logistic equations. It is another way to say what Malthus was saying. Population, time, and population grows, but it adapts to the limit, to the carrying capacity, never really reaches it, and then goes smoothly and slowly. And it's maybe, but that's not really doesn't really happen in biological population. It never happened. It is difficult to think that it can happen, because imagine you have a rabbit on an island, the whole Australia, but think of a small island. Now rabbits grow, eat the grass, and when there is no more grass, the rabbits cannot just stay there and wait for the grass to regrow. They die, so you have a collapse of the population. And this was recognized in the early 20th century by two chemists, Alfred Lotka and Vito Volterra, who produced a model that we call it today the Lotka-Volterra model. Lotka-Volterra model shows this kind of curve, population and time, which you probably know as the Hubbard curve, but it's very general, very general. And it is a fundamental point of all the story of the dynamics of population, of biological population, because it's real fundamental. What happens here, and that we learned it in time, is that the carrying capacity is overcome. The carrying capacity of the grass in an island populated by rabbits is that the rabbits should be smart enough to leave some grass alive, not eat it, so that the grass can regrow. But the rabbits, very probably, and at this point, human beings are not much better than rabbits or whatever. They grow, destroy the grass, and then they destroy themselves, they have to return. It is possible in the locomotor model to go oscillating. But as a first approximation, you have this cycle, which you call the Hubbard curve, or the typical curve of a biological population growing in the presence of relatively abundant resources. And this was observed first in epidemiology. Epidemiology, how you pronounce that? I'm not sure, but anyway, you understand what I mean. You remember at the time of the coronavirus, when we were at the beginning, people were worried, oh, we'll grow forever, we all die. No, it did follow this curve. It grew on the resources it had. Human beings, we are the resources for the viruses, and then declined as epidemics always do. It is typical of this field. This is a very general field. And this is the basic point. Just to let you know a little more, I can tell you about the Seneca curve. If I can show it to you. Yes, you can see it. The Seneca curve is like this one, but it grows slowly and collapses rapidly. And the name of the Seneca curve comes, of course, as you know, from the Roman philosopher Seneca, who proposed about 2,000 years ago. He said, oh, well, it would be nice if things were to go down, to decline as slowly as they grow. But as things stand in the universe, unfortunately, growth is slow, but ruin is rapid. And that you read a philosopher to think of this kind of things. But if you are not familiar with ancient philosophers, you can think, say, to Shakespeare, Hamlet, when Polonius says, oh, you know, it's when troubles come, they arrive not as single spies, but in battalions. Shakespeare knew about system dynamics, I think. So this is the frame we are describing. The human population is described by this kind of treatment. It will go one of these typical models, typical kind of curves. It's very unlikely that it will stabilize, but it will eventually start going down, and it is happening. I will show you in a moment, but before going to the data, I would like to spend another 5 minutes to tell you about what is this carrying capacity, what causes populations to grow against something that stops them. Why? How do they react? What happens in the detail? What do the single rabbits think when they decide, if they find a nice female rabbit, and to say, well, should I do this or not? And eventually rabbits seems to don't have much capability of planning for a long time in the future, I think. But in this, humans are not so much better, unfortunately. So, what is the limit? We start from Malthus. We are in the late 17th century, and Malthus said, oh, you have a brick wall, bang. You arrive to the limit, you starve, and you die, and that's it. And very simple, a little bit too simple, because things do change. Malthus impressed a lot, as you may know. He impressed Darwin, Charles Darwin, and his The Origin of Species. They published he 1859, and Darwin was writing mid 19th century. And Darwin built on Malthus and said, well, okay, wait a second. Okay, we have all species on this planet have this problem of food, resources. So what happens when they get close to the point at which resources start being scarce? Can they plan ahead? Because the great idea of Darwin is the ecosystem is a self-optimizing system. It works in such a way to optimize the survival of the creatures which are part of it. So Darwin says, smart guy, Darwin, obviously, says, okay, we have species, they rabbits. How many rabbitlings should a rabbit have? Well, it depends. If you are a rabbit and you have a lot of offspring, then your genes are transferred to the new generations, so the new generations also will have a lot of rabbitlings. And so in principle, there is an evolutionary pressure to have more children. Rabbits don't have children, rabbitlings or young rabbits. But also, if you have a moment of difficulty, bad weather or some sickness or the food in the grass, then if you have too many offspring, then you'll be in trouble to nourish them. So there is also pressure to have a small number of offspring. And that's summarized in two things that if you studied biology, you probably know what I mean, the K strategy and R strategy. Typical, when you study biology of populations, you have this, you learn about this. K strategy is typical of humans, also elephants and other creatures. You invest as a parent, you invest on your offspring or your children to give them resources, instruction, experience to maximize the survivability of a few offspring, a few babies or young offspring of you. If you have the R strategy, still you have as many offspring as you can, you send them in the world and hope that they will do well by themselves. This is a bit obsolete, it's not so used anymore in biology, but it is still a good way to visualize the two strategies. And we humans clearly have interest and capability to optimize our family size, which we call today family planning. It's not just a question of urge to reproduce. No, humans are way smarter than that. Maybe not so great, so smart, more smart than rabbits, but still have some capability. And this kind of idea has been moving on in biology and also in economics. In economics, there is a field of economics which sees exactly this idea. People are supposed to optimize what the economists call the utility function. And part of this utility function is how many children you have. If you want your children to be successful in life, so if you have too many, you won't be able to send all of them to school, to the university, or to college, or whatever. So you have to optimize them also in view of having them inherit as much as possible a hefty inheritance to give them a chance to have a social success in economics. In biology, then there was all a complete set of studies to see, well, what kind of signals do creatures like humans or animals or things or the beasts to have that moves them to optimize the family size? How is it understood by species which are not necessarily able to understand such things as a utility function? And at this point, you have one person who appeared. Sorry. Calhoun is scientist active in the 1960s and 1970s, is known for the mice utopia. you had that mice utopia. He did a famous experiment, which was so successful because he tried to reproduce the overpopulation, the human overpopulation, with mice. He built an enclosure, 6 square meters. He put a few couples of mice there and let them reproduce in such a way that they would always have sufficient food. The idea was to see if the mice would perceive a stress signal, an overpopulation signal, and stop or anyway control their reproduction. And apparently they did, because they went through a maximum, then they apparently lost interest in sex or in males, in females, and the colony had plenty of food, but they all died. And this story is famous, but I would not suggest you to take as anything more than a story, because if you go look at the original experiment, really was poorly done. There's not few data, uncertain, not very clear what was being measured and how, but there are many other similar experiments. It seems that stress gives a signal that you should reduce your reproduction rate. That works for humans, works for animals, for deer, for wolves, for rabbits, or whatever. It's weak, but it is one point which is important in reproduction. People under stress, well, logically, don't find so much time to think about sex or romance or things like that. Finally, and I think that this is the novelty, and you should think of another scientist, Rachel Carson, active also in the 1960s. She's known for this book, this one, Silent Spring, that you probably know about. Is one of those books which changed the world, just like The Limits to Growth, another milestone of the 20th century, because she was the first who introduced the concept of pollution. Because before the 1960s, pollution, yeah, it existed, but there was no evident interest in the concept that what we do in industry, what we do with the pesticide, what we do with insecticide, what we do with poisons in general, harms people and the ecosystem. And she was the first time when somebody worked on that. And she also noted, look, ladies and gentlemen, pollution does not just make you sick, but also reduce your reproductive capability. It's a remarkable insight. She observed that in birds, not in humans, but later on it became clear that pollution affects the human capability to reproduce. This is another book that I can show to you, this one by Shanna Swan, another very interesting book, which is part of a series of studies in which people started measuring parameters of the human reproductive system, and they found that pollution, chemical pollution, biological pollution, all kinds of pollution, not just that, Talon that says pollution, physical pollution, molecules, atoms, they affect your reproductive system. For instance, Mrs. Swan has been measuring the number of sperm cells in human males, and it has been seen, not just by her, but several experimenters, that the number of sperm cells is about halved on the average from 1950 to now. And this is a bit worrisome, because I'm sure even with half our sperm cells, we can still reproduce, but if they really decline so fast, maybe they decline Seneca style, go down very fast, and then no children would be born again. And that's not just sperm cells. You have all sorts of parameters which have to do with the reproductive system and damage to the DNA inside the cells and all sorts of things. We have listening to us today Professor Fierz, who is an expert, for instance, on the effect of testosterone reduction caused by pollution. Maybe he could tell us something later about this. And so we have these series of things which are enemies of reproduction, enemies of population growth, not enemies because they are evil. It is the consequence of population growth to generate factors which slow it down, but not just slow it down, but may arrive to a condition in which it will cause population to collapse for not just one of these effects. There is a lot of debate on whether it is pollution or it is economy, Darwin style, or stress that reduced the reproduction rate everywhere in the world. But I don't think we will ever be able to demonstrate, to show, to understand why. Probably all four these factors are at play in this reduction. Okay, and now I told you what are the causes of this effect, and now we can go see something about the results. What is the effect of this slowing down? And let me show you, if we can please have the PowerPoint presentation, please. Can we? Art?